Thank you. So what I'm going to do now is we're doing everything in a very compressed fashion here, which is kind of good because in the afternoon everybody's getting a little bit slowed down and the blood is sort of migrating from your cortex down into your viscera to digest lunch. So we're going to come at you very sort of hard and fast. I'm going to focus this little bit on neurobiology. For some very particular reasons, which I'll get to as I speak more and more quickly as the time rolls by. So I want to start, though, with, I want to go back to Ted, and just as a couple minutes, less than that, a few seconds really, of what Ted said earlier today.
That's when I started journaling. I had to, I couldn't keep up. And because the therapists and whatever had no clue as to what to do with a man who had been sexually abused, that was my primary healing tool. The first therapist I went to was a clinical psychologist, and I gave him a book.
So Ted had an experience that we all hope, obviously, is one that will happen less and less for, it's not just men, obviously. One of the things that is true when you work with men, you talk to men, quite a few of them have had pronounced lousy experiences with the mental health system. And it is perhaps particularly tragic because for so many of these men, they make one effort after often years and years and years of building up to it. And if that effort is thwarted, not so much necessarily by a very overtly negative experience, but just simply an experience with a mental health professional that is less than welcoming, less than accommodating, and that ends that effort, and it can be a decade before it happens again. So I think with the increased awareness about sexual victimization of men, that's going to happen less. Although there's a lot of work that we're going to have to do in the mental health system to make that a reality. What I want to do is something very uncharacteristic for me, which is I want to be optimistic. And to do that, I want to talk about neuroscience, because neuroscience to me is something that I think there's real grounds to be very optimistic about the impact of that knowledge base, which is just expanding just exponentially at this point. And that's what I want to talk about, but I really am going to have to talk very fast because the neurobiology of trauma has grown from a kind of a little niche field to a massive undertaking that is having an enormous impact and will have more and more so. And I'm actually going to get into it just a teeny little bit. So that's a brain, human brain. And for those of you who need orientation, this is the frontal lobes here. You're looking at the brain, like sort of from this side, okay, looking forward. And we're going to talk a lot about the frontal lobes because they're going to be very, they're essential basically for our functioning, they're essential for healing, and it is the part of the brain that is, not surprisingly, most affected by some of the therapeutic techniques that we are most familiar with and some that we're not so familiar with. Let's start with this. This is why we as human beings have a very, very elaborate fear system. Because even though if you look around the world, you would think, if I asked you a question, are human beings predators or are they prey? If you look around the world, of course, the obvious answer to that is that we are predators. In fact, we are super predators. We're preying on every other species on the planet. We're preying on the planet itself. But actually, biologically, we are built as a prey species. For the vast majority of our time on this planet, we lived in terror of real predators who ate us. And the only way that we survived on this planet as a species is that we have in our brains elaborate mechanisms for producing a fear response. That fear response is what basically gets us up a tree very fast. That fear response is it's triggered in the, I guess I have a picture here of the amygdala, I think. There we go. So these are the amygdalae. You have one on each side of your hemisphere, buried deep inside what is sometimes still called the limbic system. When you have a fear reaction, it is the amygdala that has instigated it. It fires, and there's a whole cascade of events, chain reaction within the brain that eventually also reaches down to your adrenals at the base of your kidneys. And there's a massive physiological change. But the thing about the fear response is to understand its real purpose and its context and why we have this thing called post-traumatic stress disorder, and we're talking so much about trauma and the impact of trauma on the body and the brain, is to understand it in context, you need to watch videos of chimpanzees in the wild. And you can do a lot of this now because they have remote cameras, you know, and they're motion activated, and so there are hours and hours and hours of videotapes now available of chimpanzees in the wild, and it is extraordinarily boring because this is what you see for about 14 hours every day. Chimpanzees chewing. Every now and then, the young males get worked up a little bit, you know, on my second or my third or my fourth or whatever, and they kind of, you know, they grab branches and they make hooting sounds and so forth, and that'll go on for about 15 minutes, and then it's back to chewing. Every several days or even weeks, there is an actual encounter with a predator, all right? Usually it's like a predator, you know, 100 yards away, and they'll hoot and so forth, make sure everybody's up in a tree. They hoot for a while, and then about 15 minutes later. Now just think how different that is from a child growing up in a home where there's violence, where every day that child is terrified, either because there's an actual threat or is the threat of a threat. That child's fear response system is being triggered over and over and over and over again. And I don't have time to get into the biology of that, but think about what it takes to transform a human body that fast from a heart rate of, let's say, 58 to a heart rate of 185, and a spike in blood pressure, and a spike in respiration rate, and a dramatic change in so many different aspects of the body. In fact, it is such a dramatic and dangerous event in the body that there is a built-in mechanism to shut it down. We produce steroids, glucocorticoids, whose job it is to shut down that adrenaline response. Those glucocorticoids are also extremely dangerous chemicals. The whole thing really should have a warning. I don't know what your equivalent is of the FDA, but there would be an FDA warning that this is, you know, only to be used in emergencies. And yet we have children, and we have soldiers, and we have police officers, we have people who are living their lives constantly having the system activated and then shut down, activated and shut down, and it produces dysregulation. So very quickly, and I'm going to be very mindful, you just tell me when I have to go like this, do the Mayor Daly thing, all right? The fear pathway, this is a cutaway of the human brain, all right? So you're looking at, if you put a bandsaw through my head, that's what you'd see once the blood all ran away. This is the sensory thalamus, all right? So 4 of the 5 senses run through the sensory thalamus. The sense of smell goes through the olfactory bulb. The sensory thalamus, if you perceive something through one of those 4 senses that you interpret as potentially threatening, the sensory thalamus will send signals to the amygdala. The amygdala fires, sends signals to the hypothalamus, and then to the pituitary, and then to the adrenals, again, that sit on top of your kidneys. And then, of course, you have that incredible experience, which is transformation. These people are watching the North Tower come down on 9/11. And you can see eyes open, you know, so visual acuity is maximized. Mouth open because, of course, they're sucking in oxygen in order to oxygenate all that extra blood that is being pumped by the heart that is racing now. And again, all of this is essentially to get these people up a tree very quickly. But it's a massive change in the body that also corresponds with massive changes in the brain, in the chemistry of the brain. In particular, very, very high concentrations of neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine that dramatically alter all kinds of functioning. So one of the things that happens is the brain, which is really in many ways a sensory sponge, it's designed to take in sensory information, and 99% of the time, most of that sensory information is completely irrelevant to you, so you're not even aware that your brain is processing it. But then what happens is in the context of a traumatic experience, when you have this flood, especially of dopamine and norepinephrine, is so much of that sensory experience becomes indelibly connected to terror. And the thing is that you don't get to choose which of those sensory experiences get connected to terror. So when I was teaching this at UMass Boston all through the 2000s, when I was teaching psychological trauma, basically nothing else. It was one course after another. And we had a lot of students who were in the National Guard, and of course they were getting deployed. First to Iraq and then to Afghanistan, and both, and they get redeployed and deployed again. And I would literally see these students before their deployment, they'd go deployed and they'd be back a year later and they'd be taking another course and then they'd be deployed again. And they were fascinated with this stuff and they really wanted to be in those classes, so I had a lot of students, a lot of vets. And so here's an example of this. So I'd ask students, what do you think soldiers are getting triggered by? What do you think are some of the sights and sounds and smells that are becoming indelibly associated with terror? And the students, most of whom were not vets, of course, were watching TV, and so they'd all automatically think about the IEDs, right? You're driving down one of the roads, and you're terrified about where an IED is. And that was true, but one of these guys, one of the vets, raised his hand during one of these discussions, and he said, for me, it was the smell of onions. And it was the smell of onions because during the last tour in Iraq, his unit was responsible for patrolling one of the markets in Baghdad. And he described vividly to the class what it was like to walk through these narrow alleys with stalls everywhere, with people everywhere, not knowing where the bullet was going to come from, who was going to roll a grenade, and it was just a state of absolute terror and hypervigilance. And of course, there were a lot of stalls with vegetables, including stacks, piles of onions. And in order to survive, he did what most of these soldiers did. They had all these mental tricks, and for him, the mental trick was, Lord, just let me survive so that I can go home to my wife, and we'll go shopping together. That's all I want. And he survives. And he goes home, and he and his wife go out on a Saturday morning to the supermarket to go shopping together to fulfill this dream. And he walks into the supermarket, and he walks into the fruit and vegetable section, and he has a panic attack and literally runs out of the supermarket. And it took a few weeks, but what it was the smell of onions, which he encountered in the supermarket. Now, his brain had simply recorded that, associated it with terror. He had absolutely no idea about it until he goes into, actually, it took, as I said, about 3 weeks with his therapist to figure that out. So trauma survivors are left with these kinds of really indelible associations. And that is one of the reasons why life can be pretty challenging, especially if you think about, for children who are abused in their homes, whether it's in families, whatever it is. A lot of the associations that they make are to facial expressions, tones of voice, the sound of the human voice, particular expressions around the eyes that signify or a cue to anger or rage in somebody who's abusing them. So one other thing then I want to talk about, sort of a separate thing, has to do with the body's response to stress. The brain is a miraculous organ, and one of the ways that it's miraculous is it's constantly assessing the chemical atmosphere in the brain. And the brain picks up the fact, for example, that there is a high concentration of a particular kind of neurotransmitter, and the brain, if that happens for a protracted period of time, responds by reducing the receptors that are essentially mated to those neurotransmitters in order to try to keep that balance. So here's what happens. You have a child who is constantly being having this fear response triggered, that means also secondarily then glucocorticoids are being released in response to the adrenaline response. And then there are receptors, especially here in the hippocampus, that are responsible for, essentially, they are the target site for the glucocorticoids. The brain, when you have this constant surge in glucocorticoids, says, well, we don't need, in fact, we need to reduce the number of receptor sites for glucocorticoids. And so over time it does that. It starts to reduce the receptor sites. And what that does over time is it then blunts the effect of glucocorticoids. Now, if you remember, I should give you a quiz, right? What is the role of glucocorticoids? Glucocorticoids are there to shut down the adrenaline response. So what happens to this kid? Here's what happens to the kid. He goes to school, all right? He's sitting at a desk, all right? 30 kids in the class. One kid throws something, blurts out something, there's a ruckus, all right? He's got this hyperactive adrenaline response. He reacts to that sound, to that noise, all right? Teacher then calms everybody down. All the kids who have systems that are not dysregulated, they're able to calm down because their glucocorticoids can take effect. This kid's glucocorticoids are blunted because of the reduction in receptor sites. What that means, practically speaking, is he's still ramped up. Long after the rest of the class is able to settle down, he can't. He's ramped up. How long is it before, I don't know if you have the same kind of issue with diagnoses here, but in the United States, a phenomenal percentage of boys are being diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and medicated with Ritalin. Now, some, I'm sure, genuinely have conditions that might require that, but an enormous percentage of those boys are boys who have been traumatized and whose brains are simply dysregulated, and they're being diagnosed that way. One other thing I want to talk about very quickly is explicit and implicit memory. So explicit memory is what most people think of as memory, all right? So if I asked you about an important date in your life, your wedding or something like that, an episode in your life that hopefully wasn't traumatic, but an important, I'm sorry?
You said traumatic.
Traumatic, yes. Yes. So that's what explicit memory is, all right? It's the kind of memory where you can consciously call up the memory, you can remember more details. If I asked you, start at the beginning of the day, what happened first, what happened second, so it's sequential. All of that is the responsibility here of the hippocampus, all right? Now, but there's also this thing called implicit memory, and it's mediated by our friend the amygdala. And implicit memory is completely different. Implicit memory is not conscious. You can't consciously call up implicit memory. It is essentially, it happens to you. But the thing is about implicit memory is that biologically, it is exactly the same thing. It's a memory. But most people don't think of it as a memory. So somebody, somebody comes up behind somebody who had a traumatic experience with, of abuse or something like that, and puts their hand in a particular part of their body near their neck, let's say. And they just go ballistic. And they have no idea why. And it's exactly the same as if somebody said something that triggered what they would recognize as a memory. This is a memory, all right? It biologically is exactly the same thing. There are enormous implications for this, for how we work with victims in the criminal justice system. Because when you interview somebody who's been traumatized, the standard practice, and we're working with police all over the United States and especially in the military on this, they are trained to ask trauma survivors questions essentially aimed right squarely at the hippocampus. But here's what happens in the context of trauma. Remember the dopamine and the norepinephrine? High concentrations of dopamine especially really obstruct the functioning of the hippocampus. So somebody who's been traumatized actually has degraded hippocampal memories, or normal explicit memories. Simultaneously, they have amplified implicit memories. And yet what we're doing traditionally is we're essentially interrogating the hippocampus and ignoring the amygdala. And so we essentially ignore what they are most capable of telling us about what happened to them. Okay. So now I need to get to the optimism. I realize I promised optimism and I haven't really. So I want to talk a little bit about what neuroscience is sort of promising us about healing. There's this thing, you probably have heard this term, neuroplasticity. Really what it means is that the brain keeps changing. So the brain is altered by traumatic experience because the brain is a constantly changing, evolving organ, and it's a phenomenal organ of learning. That's really its core function, is essentially learning. And so it can learn through traumatic experience, but it can also learn positive experience or healing experiences, experiences that transform the changes that have occurred as a result of the trauma. And how does that happen? It happens, actually neuroscientists believe that this was impossible, that we don't grow new neurons. Now it turns out that we do. At this point it looks like it's a fairly limited function, but the main aspects of neuroplasticity or mechanisms of it are the growth of new neurons and the strengthening of synapses, rather the growth of new synapses and the strengthening of those synapses. And synapses are the place where two neurons communicate with each other, and we are constantly, literally on a daily basis, adding new synapses, which allow parts of our brain to communicate with each other that weren't communicating with each other like this morning. So any of you who have learned anything today, just one thing, that's a product of new synapses that have been created as a result of your being here, listening, and actively participating mentally in what's going on here today. So the brain is constantly changing. So I want to talk about, do I have time to talk about the Dalai Lama? How much time? 5 minutes? Okay, sure. That's enough time to talk about the Dalai Lama. All right, so here, this squiggle here represents, we'll use me, okay? All right, so here, this is the neural networks that were created when I was abused when I was 5 years old, all right? And now, obviously, this is just a schematization, but they exist, all right? There are neural networks, thousands of neurons interconnected, communicating with each other, that are the networks that get triggered when, various kinds of sights and sounds and smells and so forth, when I encounter them and they trigger, and I get that sort of triggered reaction, that fear response and so forth. So here's the Dalai Lama. You thought I was kidding, right? So here's the Dalai Lama, and I put him up there because I love that face, and a warm, compassionate face. And I have this idea, I would love to go sit and talk with the Dalai Lama, all right? So let's just imagine that I do. And I've been using this slide here for a long time. It turns out there's a woman who did exactly this, all right, which really bugs me because she did it and I didn't. She got to have literally an audience with the Dalai Lama. So I'm going to pretend, so I go and have this audience with the Dalai Lama. So I walk in, all right, and there he is. And there is that face, okay? So now when I see his face, this is the occipital lobe here, the back of the brain. This is the visual center where visual integration takes place. And for me to have the experience and actually see him, there are massive numbers of neurons here in the occipital lobe that are now firing because of that. But now this is just the beginning, because I'm not just looking at something neutral, I'm looking at the Dalai Lama, this face that is full of, to me, of compassion and love, and that triggers all kinds of neural activity here in the right hemisphere, where we have facial recognition and emotion responses and emotion recognition and so forth. And this is just, really just touching the surface of what's actually going on in my brain. And then I start talking to him about my experience, which of course means that my left hemisphere, the whole language center of the brain, is now activated. Well, if you look here, and I realize these are just squiggly lines, but what they represent are massive neural networks that are now firing at the same time as the trauma network. Well, guess what starts to happen? Synapses. New synapses are formed. Now these networks become interconnected. So let's fast forward a little bit. Let's say this is a really important, profound experience, because I actually think it would be. All right? So let's fast forward 6 months. And something happens that triggers this neural network. What also happens when that network starts firing? All these other networks start firing. All of a sudden, I'm remembering what it was like to sit in the room with the Dalai Lama. What it was like to have that experience of having this man of compassion listening to me and listening to my story. And that transforms my experience. And we're just talking about one little experience here. So the last thing I'm going to say is we're talking about this over lunch. What if instead of we're talking about the Dalai Lama here, what if I said to my therapist, I don't like talking, all right? I think it's bullshit. Well, what do you like? I like riding my bike. Why do you like riding your bike? Because I feel strong. I feel like, you know, I can get away from anybody who's after me. And, well, I'll tell you what I want you to do then. You don't like talking. I want you to get on your bike. And we'll work out, we'll start with some small little things, some little parts of the trauma that you experienced. And you start that thinking about it, and then get on your bike and start riding. What do you think happens in my brain when that happens? What we've just done is created a therapeutic experience. Except it's not, I don't know what you'd call it, right? Cyclotherapy. The point is, once we understand the brain and how the brain is functioning, and how the brain changes as a result of these kinds of healing experiences, we are no longer tied to methods of treatment that are frankly completely impractical given the billions of people on this planet who suffer trauma and frankly don't have access to mental health services and never will. So we need this kind of model so that we can use our creativity and come up with means of helping people to heal from these kinds of experiences in ways that fit into their lives and that have nothing to do with the traditional mechanisms that we have developed, especially in the Western world, the traditional methods of psychotherapy. Because with this kind of neurobiological understanding of trauma and how the brain responds and also heals from trauma, there's really no limit to the kinds of applications that we can come up with. Thank you.